Welcome, everybody. I think this is the last session of the day, so thank you for hanging in there with us. We've saved the best for last, I hope. I hope it's been a good conference. I'm Shane Harris. I cover intelligence and national security for the Washington Post, and very pleased to be here moderating this panel on open source intelligence, a topic that has been certainly front of my mind lately with the war in Ukraine and just an unbelievable amount of open source information and intelligence that we've seen in that conflict, but perhaps we'll touch on that today with our three panelists. We have a great group here, so we're going to get started. Immediately to my left is Joe Oberberger. He is a software engineer in the space and intel sector with Peraton. And we also have Megan Dane, the director for plans and programs at the Naval Intelligence Activity, and Andy Henson, the senior vice president for artificial intelligence for SAIC. So thank you to you all for being here. I want to start out just by trying to get a sense of the scale and the scope and kind of bounding this discussion, because when we say open source intelligence and open source information, it could be literally anything you see on the internet, right? It can be things that are produced by people like me in the press. It's tweets, it's YouTube videos. It's kind of an overwhelming amount of information. So Joe, maybe just to you, when we talk about this, and maybe even for the purposes of our discussion as we're talking about it, certainly within a kind of security and military context, how do you sort of bound that universe and begin to think about it and what it encompasses?
Yeah, so I like big data, and I cannot lie. It's a huge problem, right? The number of tweets per day, the number of YouTube videos per day, 720,000 hours of YouTube videos are uploaded per day. So if you were to watch that, it would take you 82 years for one day to watch. So how can we build systems that can scale to that level? If you consider just 1 billion records, if it takes a computer 1 millisecond to process 1 billion records, that's 11.5 days for one system to do that. So we need to deal with trillions of records. So the problem of scale is one of my favorite things to deal with. So all the things you guys have heard of before, big data, Hadoop, Cassandra, all the NoSQL stores, things like that. But it's a challenge because there is a lot of stuff that we are not interested in with open source. So most of the intelligence community doesn't care about Justin Bieber and things like that. They're concerned with what terrorists are doing, what they're saying on Telegram, things going on in Ukraine, how they are communicating, what they're saying, and that sort of data. So how can we filter out the data, and then how can we get the important data to those that can make decisions?
Yeah, Megan, can you give us a sense too, just coming from your perspective in the Navy and in naval intelligence, in that kind of massive sea of data, if you'll pardon the pun, what is useful, what is not? I mean, what's in the Bieber category versus the useful category for you?
Yeah, so I think the conversation starts with the aspect of what is OSINT versus what is open source. So we make a really clear distinction. OSINT is the discipline, not the domain. Mm-hmm. The domain is the PAI environment with all of the multitudes of different types of information sources and structures and things like that. So we're really concerned with what helps us create OSINT that then can go into the analytic process, that then can be merged with the other intelligence disciplines in order to create forward-leaning analysis and things of that nature. So in that case, we are really concerned with what types of information we're looking at and what we're not looking at, and we try to really leverage the commercial industry and what you are able to create through aggregation and big data analysis and things of that nature, and then really pinpoint through requirements what information sources and streams we need to ingest, and then really clear the way for our analysts so that they don't have to ingest or siphon through all the rest of it.
Right.
So that's really the most important part for us within that front-end process, is not engaging in the entire information sphere.
Right.
Really just pinpointing based off requirements where we need to focus our attentions.
So requirements kind of drive the vetting and the filtering as it's coming
Absolutely, and of course those have to be driven from the analysts and from the problems of the mission itself. We work hand in hand with both the environment of OSINT writ large as a discipline from a functional management standpoint to try to bring in opportunities and new accesses and things like that nature, while also remaining true to what the analysts are traditionally accustomed to using and incorporating into their analysis and into their process, so that they can really balance those things It's constantly, we've heard a lot today about AI and innovation, and we do lean heavily on that, but we also have to make sure that it integrates into our systems, it integrates into their processes, that they can make meaning out of that. The 4 V's are very important to us as we access and limit our open source information environment. So that's kind of where we take it from.
I would think that the making sense of it and the meaning and finding what's meaningful, obviously the key. Andy, I'm curious if that challenge has gotten easier or harder as the volume just kind of seems to be swelling. I think for us in the press, in many ways, it's gotten harder. Yeah. I'm curious what you think.
No, I think it's definitely gotten harder. I think it's gotten harder to know what matters, right? So I think that one of the big challenges with open source intelligence is that you get, I think it's a good and a bad, right? But the reality of it is that there's more human language in it, right? With technical means of collection, if it's satellite imagery, it's waveforms. We know how to interpret waveforms. They are right or wrong. They meet a certain level of goodness before we decide, yeah, it's a good picture or not. But someone's opinion in a tweet, that's difficult. So I think that introduces a bigger challenge, but also an opportunity, right? Because it forces natural language processing and some of these other capabilities that maybe weren't as prevalent in Intel before, where we are now have this big body of knowledge to be able to train things on from a pure technology standpoint. But it's hard. I mean, what's the stat? Like 92% of all data has been generated in the last 2 years of history, right? Yeah. That's a massive challenge. And I think really, my really simple filter is, what question do we want to ask of the data? That gets rid of a lot of noise, right? Not all, and some noise is good, right? But what question do we want to ask of the data? And then we can get to a real subset of the data and start getting at some of those challenges. But sometimes we don't know the question. Yeah. Right. That's some of open source intel. That's some of what you do, right? Is go find out what's the right questions to be asking of the data. Two different challenges.
To drill down on that, what's an example of a typical, when we say ask a question of the data? I mean, maybe take it from an operational naval standpoint, or you guys can all answer this, but what are questions we can ask data, and what realistically are like answers we can expect to get back when we're talking about technology to do that?
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at it, and then of course, Megan, you have a good perspective on this, I bet, right? I think there's a very simple, what has already happened? Let's look back and count something. That's a very simple way to look at data, all the way to let's predict what's going to happen next based on what we know about the area, the data that we've collected in the history, and that can range from the very well-defined, when are my parts going to fail, all the way to, and lots of good open source on that, all the way to like, hey, when's the next bad thing going to happen? Right. Well, obviously a lot harder.
Right.
Yeah, I think we underestimate the value of baselining the information environment, creating a baseline of information based off open source or all the different aspects that give us an understanding of what is normal within an information environment, what is normative within that structured information environment. And then so we can then focus our attention on the anomalies. And that really saves a lot of time. If we're having to constantly reinvent and re-understand what they're saying on a particular topic, then that's a lot of time that's wasted if we can just focus on they're saying something different, they're saying something new, then that's something that we can then leverage, and technologies can help us with that, but they're not the sole element of that. Humans, translation, foreign language research, these are all types of foundational capabilities that when you intersect them with a analyst and a librarian and a data scientist and things like that, you can create an information environment that allows us to kind of posture ourselves for those anomalous behaviors or those key events that are going to drive change.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, so consider like the Boston bombing. So the number of tweets coming out of Boston, you're talking about the normal, right? Where we can like look at this and just use statistics and be like, here's the number coming out from that area. And now an event's happening, right? Now it's 10x what it was. So some things are really simple to detect. Other things like the natural language processing was mentioned, intent, sentiment. So sentiment can be good, bad, but it can also mean happy, sad, angry. And there's all sorts of different types of sentiment analysis to be applied to the data. So figuring out the question that we want to answer, it can be a challenge. But just looking at the normal and using machine learning to figure out this is what normal looks like. Now there's this anomaly or anomaly detection is another challenge with open source.
One of the things I think we find a lot of it and as reporters is we might write a story and then we start seeing sort of a flood of comments coming back that all start to sound familiar and kind of all the same, and they're kind of like singing a chorus, which leads us sometimes to wonder, are these just bots? Are these things that are automated to kind of throw information back at us and give the impression that there is some kind of issue that people are taking with the story, or to kind of develop an argument even supporting what they like in the story? So I mean, how do we kind of cut through that? Which, I mean, it strikes me as, I don't want to say it's disinformation coming out there, but there's a misinformation component too. So how do you grapple with that when anybody can fire off a tweet or set a bunch of bots to respond to keywords or themes?
Yeah. Misinformation is, it's going to be the next big challenge for everyone. I mean, it is our current challenge, but it's going to become exponentially worse as time goes on.
That's not encouraging.
It's not. There was an article just today in The Guardian about some of the prisoners of war in Ukraine, the Russian soldiers, and the construct of them, they're having them call their mothers at home, explain to them their circumstances and situations. And essentially, their own mothers are, well, that's not what I see on TV. That's not what I'm being told. Yeah. And they're reiterating what they're hearing in their media environment, and challenging their own children. So that's the environment that we're in. And I think we've seen this in our own environment in the past few years. And it's as you said, anyone can write a tweet, and the sentiment that comes along with being kind of part of a popular feeling about something, and then the explosion of that, and really that veracity aspect of how much of this is real, how much of it is seeded, how much of it is, people just want to feel popular, so they're adding on to the things that are already happening, and then how do we separate all that? So that is a major challenge that we have, and in our environment, of course, we need to make meaning of those things, and we need to get to truth before we want to start informing those other aspects. But we're going to have to grapple with the speed and the timeliness of that as well. So the timeliness factor does come into play when you're trying to make decisions based off this information, which is why we try to integrate it with our other disciplines. But if you're solely looking at the open source environment, there's that background information, that kind of baselining the information environment helps with that, but it does not solve the problem.
Yeah, the problem's big. I mean, so low risk, high reward. Consider like ransomware. It's low risk, high reward. Same with the bots. It's so easy to put these things in place and hire a bunch of people to sit in a room, very cheap, high reward. So combating that, yes, there's some technologies that we can use. Like we've all gotten emails where you like mouse over the link and you're like, it says from the Washington Post. Then you mouse over it, it's gobbledygook, dot. I'll think of something, but something else.
Hopefully you don't get too many of those.
Sorry, sorry, terrible example. But yeah, so there are some things that we can use with machine learning to like look at all the data. What IP addresses are it coming from? Can we geolocate those and figure some of that out? All that's spoofable though, so it is it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I think the question is what's good enough. Right, for what question we're trying to answer, right? And I think the previous folks that were up here were saying, like if I'm just trying to figure out if somebody's looking at a base or looking at a platform, I don't need to exploit the whole thing to know if there's something looking, right? I can just, to your point about are there bots? Sometimes it doesn't matter. Right? Sometimes we just want to know, is there anyone talking about a subject? Is there anyone talking more or less about a subject? And if there's bots, maybe that is actually not a bad thing, right? Maybe that's a good thing from an intel perspective.
Right, might be indicative
not from a misinformation perspective,
right? Sure.
But it might be indicative that it's of interest to some other group, right? And so I think that, and this goes to like, this idea that for a long time, I think, large nation states had information or data advantage over very nearly everybody. I think that's gone to a large degree. And so I think the question becomes like, well, it's out there now. It's going to happen. Deep fakes are going to fake videos to a degree that you can't tell if it's real or not, which used to be the highest bar of truth, right? So what is the veracity of it, right? And when does it matter that it's corroborated enough times to to be good enough for the decision we're trying to make, right? I think a lot of times we try to engineer it to like the highest level of decision if we're going to, do something kinetic that makes sense, right? If we're just trying to decide on, whether or not we're having influence in an area, for instance, what's the level of good enough? I think we struggle with that. I think we all struggle with what's good enough to make a decision on. And I think that changes based on our risk tolerance of the area that we're in, right? And what we're trying to accomplish.
The deep fake phenomenon, or maybe it's just more the evolution. I mean, it seems like it's kind of hit this inflection point. And I notice it in sort of a pop culture kind of way. There's an account that's constantly popping up on my Twitter and my Instagram that is somebody who does a deep fake of Tom Cruise.
Yep.
And the first time I saw it, I mean, I genuinely thought it was like Tom Cruise sitting in somebody's kitchen. And as you watch the videos, you realize the context, oh, right, this isn't real. It's somebody showing off the technology. But it's arresting how good it is. And I wonder, folks in the national security community have been warning for some time and worrying about when that technology is going to be deployed to do a deep fake about a national leader or a political candidate. I mean, don't want to make you be doomsaying about this, but like how close are we to that being deployed in a kind of information warfare context, do you think? Or is it happening right now?
We saw it with Zelensky, right? They put out hey, we're, surrender.
Yep.
It was a terrible one, but how long before it's easy enough?
Right, faking that he was surrendering.
That he was surrendering, yeah. So I think now is the answer. I think it's easy enough to do, and I think it's open sourced enough now that you could do it to a degree of, you gave the example of the parents saying, well, that's not what I saw on TV. Yeah. It doesn't take much to show whatever you want on TV.
Right. Let's talk about Ukraine a bit, because this is such a great example of, there's so many things we could discuss in it. It's, the amount of information that people are able to ingest about this conflict, it's just staggering. I mean, you could go on Twitter all day and just kind of watch it happening in real time. I know at the Post, we actually have, we have huge numbers of reporters on this. We use Slack as an internal communication system. There's a channel that we have just devoted to Ukraine. And it is truly, it's like a ticker with just things constantly, reports from reporters, tweets that we're seeing, videos that are popping up, statements from governments. Now, not all of that open source, some of that's coming from our reporters in the field, but it's just an astonishing amount of information. I'm just curious, just as an initial matter, your impressions, each of you, of what you see the role of that open source information being, not just in informing the public, but in how it's starting to shape the contours of how people think about this war. Maybe Joe, you have some thoughts on that.
Wow.
As a first point, maybe just the way that Zelensky has kind of shaped the discussion about the war in a way that Putin arguably has not.
Yeah,
outside of Russia,
it's kind of unprecedented. It's a new way of waging this type of activity. It's not he can the ability for these leaders to use Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, and so forth to deliver information out about what's happening or what's not happening. Is I think it's a new thing that we're going to have to really dive into, and as you mentioned, the scale is, and the fake news part of it, what's real and what's not. Trying to build models that can figure out what is true and what is not is a huge challenge that humans have to be involved in. I don't have the answer for that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting, we're seeing the burgeoning of the information battlefield. It's the aspect of, and you think you hit it on the head with the aspect of the public sentiment part comes first, and then the diplomatic element comes next. So it starts with I'm leveraging this information and producing it and putting it out into the world so that, people know what's happening, that they can, they'll believe us, they're on our, they feel it, they're on our side, they can support us. And then that is having real meaning in the diplomatic environment, and the UN speech today, and the aspect of here are real things that are happening, and most of that information is videos or pictures or firsthand accounts and things of that nature that they're leveraging to then force or try to force world leaders to make decisions in particular ways. And so I think while within this environment and this campaign that we see from the Ukrainian side, there's a lot of, it's helping that aspect of it, people to understand and to clear up some of the misinformation we talked about. That's not always going to be how it's used. It's not always going to be in that manner. And we have seen the opposite of that. And while we don't receive as much of the opposite side of what's occurring, a large swath of the world does. And their decisions are being made off of different information. Right. So if we are engaging in a conversation and in a battle space by which we are in different fields, but it's all overlapping at the same time. So how do you approach that? And you're right, there's no easy answer. There's no solution to it. The Secretary of the Navy during his luncheon spoke about the freedom of the press being part of one of the aspects of democracy and the power and the freedom that we have in those environments. But there are challenges within that as well, because we cannot control the environment to the degree that other places can. And so how do you fight on that uneven battlefield? So these are solutions that we try to, we can't fix, but we try to address that when we are examining the open source, when we are putting it into context with the other intelligence disciplines. And it's and making sure that it's a part of the conversation, so that the full scope and spectrum of that environment can be understood before the decision is made.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There's two key things about this particular conflict that have been interesting, both that the information is getting out in very nearly real time. As it's happening, it's being posted, but also the platforms it's coming out on. I think it's targeting a different audience than before. It's not just coming out in the post. It's coming out on TikTok and Twitter, and a generation of people who wouldn't take the time to read a large article maybe are getting the news about a conflict in 1 to 3 minute increments. Right, and not checking any veracity of it. Don't care to go do their own research on it. That's fine. I mean, but I think that target of that audience goes to some challenges, certainly, but I think it also changes whole population sentiments very, very quickly on a particular thing. I think the horrors that are currently unfolding there and went from 2 days ago to whole nations expelling diplomats in 2 days because populaces found out about it much faster, which would have been the realm of an intelligence organization 10 years ago or 20 years ago, only getting that kind of information through diplomatic means, right? And now it's just out there. You can't stop that. You can't put that toothpaste back in the bottle. And I think it means we act differently. I think it means we react differently. And I also think that it goes back to the data dominance, and it's gone. It's democratized, if you will, and how we have to change. We were talking about OSINT being a discipline. How disciplines actually have to change around that as well. Do we spend our resources on collecting Twitter information anymore? I mean, it's out there, right? I think there's also an interesting aspect to the declassification or open sourcing of intelligence as well, not to lead you there if you were going to go that
I was going to go there next.
Sorry, I was reading it. But like that's new, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden we're pushing down what was otherwise. But for a lot of the reasons, like a lot of that stuff was already coming out in some of those platforms we were just talking about.
Yeah, well, and we should pivot to that, and I can talk about the role I individually have played in that, and others have, journalists too. I mean, if we go back to December 3rd, the Biden administration, there's an excellent article in the Wall Street Journal that came out yesterday giving some of the backstory to this, which was, I didn't know even some of it. But on December 3rd, we published at the Post an article that contained declassified government intelligence that consisted of satellite imagery along with analysis that showed Russian forces mobilizing and massing on the borders of Ukraine. And the assessment there was that the U.S. believes that upwards of 175,000 troops could be in position to invade when Putin was ready to give the order. And that was a very unusual story in that it involved the administration with the authority of the president declassifying intelligence for the purposes of putting it into the press and getting it out into the world. And that kind of triggered this cascade of other I think what they called downgrade and disclose, I think was the way they called downgrade is and downgrade the level of intelligence. And it was not lost on those of us who were reporting on that in the beginning, like, well, this is new. Usually this is the kind of information that people might pass to us when they're not supposed to. And you could see very quickly, well, not very quickly, but in the weeks that followed, that there was a pattern to this and that the administration was going to start declassifying intelligence that it had in a way that they had vetted and felt was appropriate and could guard the sources and methods, but there might be some risk to that. one of the things that was fascinating about that first disclosure, which was the only one that I'm aware of that involves satellite imagery, was that you could also take that satellite image and compare it to commercially available satellite data. And you could look at it and say, yes, these are showing the same pictures. They're showing the same things. And we can layer onto that the analysis that the government is making, which presumably is coming from more than just the one channel of the imagery. But that made it very powerful and gave us actually a lot of confidence in the press of saying, okay, we feel that this is credible information that we can take to our readers because we can corroborate it from other places and we're not just taking talking points and spewing them out. So I'm kind of curious what you all think about this. You know, I don't know if it's revolutionary in the sense that governments have occasionally put out information that they want the press to have, but this was a really concerted effort to say we're going to do this in order to shape the information space, to head the Russians off at the pass, not necessarily to preempt them and to stop them from invading, but to say we're going to take away your ability to just act with impunity with things like saying Ukraine started this. We're going to call you out for saying that you were trying to do a false flag attack. We're going to call you out for trying to replace the government in Kyiv. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating.
No, I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, you're talking through your process there. I was welcome to intelligence analysis.
Precisely, exactly. It's a very similar profession, actually, journalism and intelligence.
And that's exactly, kind of the process going forward. But I think that, the recognition that this is a different information environment, this is a different time, as well as, the playbook was there. So there, I think there's a little bit of that as well. The playbook was there. We had experience with how they were going to kind of try to inform the public about their steps and what their process was. So heading that off in the past was, I think, an important element of the entire process of getting the real story, or getting our side of the story and the reality out. And so that was a lessons learned. It was an aspect of we've seen in the past, maybe we didn't do the same thing, and so now how do we go forward in the future? We talk a lot in the government, particularly in the intelligence community, and some of the other national security environments about working with our partners and allies, particularly in the open source world, because as we've talked, the volume, that other V is so wide and vast and deep that we're never going to all get through it. And so we have to split it up to some degree, or we have to leverage each other in some ways. And some of our Eastern European partners have been very on the front end of this pointy spear for a long time. And then some other elements have historically have that long history element that they can draw upon. And so how do we leverage our best athlete within this environment for the information writ large? But it's something that the government, I think, is looking towards how do we innovate in that area. Innovation is not always just about tools. It's about processes, it's about policies. A lot of the innovation discussion today has been around acquisition processes, which we have our own fun with in the open source world. But innovating how we think about this process, how we think about the purpose of the process is also just as important. And as we get all these people who are accustomed to different information environments and widen that aperture and the spectrum of what they expect to be able to engage in as part of the dialogue for how they make decisions, we are training ourselves about how do we give them better processes and information to do so.
Yeah, I think it uncovers this concept of decision advantage, right? What we saw there that was unclassified was we decided already. We had decided something and we knew that everyone else could come to that conclusion pretty quickly. Right. And I think that's the new realm, is decision advantage, where we used to fight over data or fight with data. It's out there. I mean, we're not ahead there. I mean, everybody's got the same accesses within reason, especially in the open source side. And I think, but the decision advantage, that's where we can really still fight. And I think, algorithms help that and technology helps that, but it's still the processes that are implying and that we are employing against that data. And I think that's a great example. It's something that there was a small window in your Ukraine example, right? Had to get that out. And it came in and everybody could corroborate it, as you said, but it shaped the narrative from there on out, right? And it got ahead of all of the counter narrative that was coming out and did come out. But it was already out on TikTok. It was already out on Twitter that this was what's going to happen, and frankly, people, love a good scoop, as you know, right? And it was the scoop. And I think that playing on that level of the way people are consuming information in that decision advantage realm, instead of saying, hey, they could have just said, here's the data, go look for yourself and see what we're saying. But we'd already made a decision. We'd made an assessment as a country. And I think we didn't have this in Crimea. We didn't have this in Syria.
Right.
Didn't have this in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we were having this decision advantage. Yes, we had decision advantage, but to release it to the population, it's fascinating.
Yeah, governments becoming an open source producer versus a consumer. Right? For me, it's always been about, I've got all this data. What are we going to do about it? Now it's, what are we going to make? What are we going to produce? And what do we want to tell out? And in what platform? And these platforms have, they always say, right, data is the new oil. These platforms have enormous power, right? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, at some point, there's servers somewhere that have this data on them and people that have access to that data. Big power there, and I'm curious to know where that's headed. Like, where do we, how is that? Because they can put, as we saw, Facebook, censors this person, and it's a big conspiracy, right? So, but they have the power to do that. They own that data. So it's the whole privacy, all that stuff comes into play. But I really think it's fascinating about how governments now are producing this information out to effect.
And just to build on a point you made too, Andy, what was so interesting, the fact that it was coming from the government, right? The fact that it was on the front page of a big newspaper, it gives it that element of kind of authenticity, credibility, a little bit of secrecy. It kind of had a little bit of flavor on it. And in fact, when we were reporting this in the newsroom, I mean, there was a moment where we kind of looked at this and said, well, people know this already, right? Because we've all seen the satellite images, and we're tracking this. But you realize in that moment, like, yes, but they're not hearing it the way they're about to hear it. And when that story landed, you're absolutely right. It changed very much the way people were talking. It brought it to a different level of attention. So there too, it's sometimes, if you're the government, it maybe is not enough simply to just put it into the domain. It's how you present it in that domain as well.
I think that's a great example of it was a lot of noise at the time, and plucking something out and say, hey, this is above the noise. This is important. Yeah, this is important. And I think that's the problem right now. We're inundated with noise on all of those topics. And open source intel, that's the whole point, right? It's to pluck out, this is important in that noise. Really interesting to see the government doing that, right? As opposed to let's leave it up to the analysts and we'll get work products out, and eventually that'll come down to our partners. It's that whole cycle is turning into hours, minutes even, instead of what used to be days even a decade ago.
Yeah, and I think that you see the partnership on the government side with the diplomatic and the defense side of the house in respect to this conversation. It was an overt conversation in respect to how do we leverage these things in places where we maybe haven't historically. The state side and defense side working together. They're attending all the meetings together, engaging in the conversation together, and then how can we make meaning within that conversation to the purposes of what the administration wants to ensure that we're moving forward on. So that's a public partnership as opposed to a public private partnership, and then we engage with the private sector because of the breadth of the audience, the fact that it is left to you to then corroborate on your own, so then that makes a different sort of meaning from it. So I think that's an important aspect of how we need to think about governance holistically within this environment in particular, and I think that you'll see that there are more opportunities for this going forward. And so our job is to ensure that the best possible information is within that conversation.
Right. I want to pivot to another subject of which there's an abundance of open source information, and not necessarily, sometimes can feel so overwhelming and dire, and it's the subject of climate change, right? So much of what we know about, well, I dare say everything we really know about, like the science of the climate and the nature of a changing climate, is coming from open source information. It's coming from sensors and scientists who study this, and it's accumulated information. Megan, let me just start with you. Say some words on climate change as it affects what the Navy does and the role that open source information and intelligence plays there.
Yeah, so of all the services, and I'm sure they're all on the leading edge, but the Navy in particular, climate change is a massive problem for us. It's a challenge that we have to address, and we have to address it now because coastal regions being what they are, supply chain environments, the undersea cables, every element of what we do to protect national security within the maritime domain is affected in some way, shape, or form. And so we have to be on the leading edge of how do we integrate the best practices from industry, how do we take that information that we are not creating, although we do have a lot of great scientists who work specifically on our problem sets to help us to make better decisions in that space. And then how do we move forward with that information? So it's not just the information itself, because you're right, it is the vast majority of it is open source, science-based. You know, we want that information to be collaborated with as many people as possible, across as many allies and partners as possible, to get the best information in. But then how do we leverage that information in not just the intelligence side of the house, but the acquisition side of the house? How do we integrate and do intelligence support to acquisition so that we are leveraging those types of information sources within the space where they can make meaning to the mission going forward? It's not enough just to say that, you know, Norfolk's going to be flooded and, you know, my old ship is going to be, you know, floating down the Bay Capes. It's how do we address that within our structured supply chain, within our, you know, industrial integration, and then how do we start to train our workforce to understand that when they see events or activities or processes, how do they integrate that back into the information that we use from an intelligence side? And that's one of the things I think that's really interesting to see, is how do we take on board information from non-traditional sources? And some of those non-traditional sources are our own forces and our own environment and our own scientists and things like that, which has been something that I've seen over the past decade or so growing, and that's a really positive aspect to open source we don't generally think about, because people are so focused on the bots or the Twitters or the tweets and things of that nature. There are other types of information that are, you know, far more important to some of our conversations.
Right. Joe, what are your thoughts on how this climate change is intersecting with this abundant universe of information?
Yeah, I mean, so data correlation is you know, the whole, you know, 9/11 kind of revealed that data correlation is a problem. So these guys know this piece of information, these guys know this piece of information. If we just stuck them together, maybe we'd see the whole picture. And that certainly plays here as well. So from the research and development side of the house, this is one of the things that we're really diving into. How do we automatically correlate disparate data sources? A simple example, I've got cell tower records or cell phone records, and I've got Visa account records, and I've got Twitter data. And this tweet happened at the same time within 1 meter of this cell phone transaction, so we can stick those together. So we can look at space and time, and we can look at space and time together. But when you start looking at, you know, more complex things like climate change, machines are really good at math, so they can automatically correlate data pretty well. So taking hundreds, thousands, millions of data sources and trying to come up with the right picture and then presenting said picture in a meaningful fashion is where we're after with research. It's an exciting area.
I think climate change is one of the areas that we have failed at with open source. I think it's a good example where decision advantage wasn't gained. And the noise took over. I think for every report you could find, there was another report that someone else said something at least confusing, if not counter, right, to the thing. And I think it's been a real problem for long enough that it's just become noise in many ways. I think it's an opportunity where decisions could have been made, and then when they were made, we could have traced them back to that open source, that report, that science. And in some cases we have, big we. But there are a lot more times when it was like, we made a decision to do something as a country, and trust us, it was a good idea, right? And it would have been a good idea to do what we were just talking about, which is trace it back to here's the reasons we made those decisions, go corroborate them yourself. But it's also one of those areas that's really, really technical, right? And trying to present that highly technical information to the masses, I think one of the challenges is we don't have the populace behind it, right? We don't, and for lots of reasons, but we don't have the populace in any one way behind it. We need it, we should, and we don't. And so I count it as one of those things that, and we didn't have the processes in place we have now. We didn't have the channels and things that we had. You know, data was collected on this in the 90s and has been every year since, more and more. And we still haven't received decision advantage. Decisions are taking years to make. when we have data every day on it. And I think this is an example of the other end of the spectrum where we've flooded the field with data. We've got open source intel on it. We know what's going to happen. I think it was just published yesterday, right? This will be unlivable. It's not a question of if we will be able to live on this planet or not if we continue to. But where is the decision advantage that we're taking out of that intelligence that we're gathering? I think it's just like, oh, that's tough. What we aren't doing is like, what do we do about that? As opposed to some of the other examples we've used, it was like very clear what we do about it. We should have more sanctions on that, right? And so I think it was a clear decision path, and it's a tricky part with climate change. And I think it's a challenge with open source intelligence in general when there's too much noise. You can't get to a decision.
We want to turn this to audience Q&A now and give you all time to ask questions that are in your mind. There's a mic right here in the front. If people want to come up now or think about a question and make your way while I ask maybe one more question, but invite you to come now if anybody has a question. Yeah, go right ahead, please.
I'll warm up the waters for the rest of us. I'm ending a 40-year career across NASA, NOAA, mission to planet Earth, where we did baseline and correlate the data. Lived the frustration of inconvenient truth. Gore made an admission of his after giving up an election that maybe he shouldn't have. Data has become ubiquitous. Data, information, knowledge, wisdom is global. And the more we treat these as global challenges and address it globally, the answer to Putin would not be here without NATO allies, without the leak and useful dissemination of true intelligence with the decision advantage, except that's not permeating Russian mothers or losing sons. And so I have a real sense that I like the way the path that this panel has taken, ending up with climate change, because my kids think I'm a technocrat and have an irrational belief that technology can fix it. Climate change, for a lot of the youth under 30 are not getting involved. You can see in this conference, there's a dearth of young people entering government civilian contractors. Roles that need to be filled. Is there a role for data-driven correlation and dual-use technology? I'm thinking that these concepts for Superfund cleanup is a diplomatic path for the Navy to get involved with, train our sailors to learn about new ways that a sailor can spend 20 years in one skill set, but if it's dual use, maybe they have another 20 years doing climate activism with data activism. And that's where the term data activist comes to mind. Yeah. Some of the best pull for new challenges in the university and research sector is to give the young college grads that data activist sense that this is a grand challenge. And it crosses agencies, it crosses services, it crosses civilian sectors, it crosses over, it's global. So global challenges and understanding in our acquisition policy how it's important for the Navy to cross-train about the sensitivity to what are these issues and how can we address. I mean, you're addressing climate justice issues in third world countries.
Yeah, well, let's give our panelists a chance to respond to the interesting points that you put out. Is there anything in there that you want to have a crack at?
I think first and foremost, data literacy is on the rise. I think we hold more data in sensors in our pockets, in our hands, on our devices, right, than we ever have before. And I think we're seeing a correlated increase in insights, and there's young people who are influencing on social media using data insights to know when to post their stuff, when they're going to get the most engagement with the audience. That's OSINT. I mean, that was OSINT techniques before. So I think that data literacy is on the rise, and how do you translate that into action? It's much more a part of the next generation's activities than it was ever a part of previous generations in general. I think we're seeing data activism. I think we're seeing it in climate change. I think we're seeing it in organizations that are popping up in sort of self-organized groups, Facebook groups and others, that they can go find a way to get involved. We see it across the political spectrum. I think we're seeing it across grassroots in general. I think that is data activism. There's a long ways to go on climate change there. I think there's a lot of good that can be done and is being done. I think I take an issue with that the next generation's not getting involved. I think they are getting involved. I think they're getting involved in different ways than we're used to measuring.
Okay. Yeah, I think that even with universities, there's now degrees in data science. And what is that? Well, it's this kind of blend of artificial learning, machine learning, statistics, hacking. I mean, you kind of stick those three together and you poop out a data scientist that everyone wants. So I think with the universities, it's happening. I really like the example about when to post your YouTube video. That's all true. I mean, and now it's starting to become common knowledge, that sort of thing. It's good stuff.
Okay, next question, please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm a huge fan of rational security.
Oh,
so
hey, thanks.
It's great to see you here.
Thanks a lot.
So my question involves traditionally trained intelligence analysts and someone like me who, learned how to do the very regular forms of intelligence analysis, gathering the data and producing a product for the customer. How do you incorporate people like that into learning how to do constantly changing open source analysis? And not only that, but how do you incorporate the methods of, like we talked about, natural language learning? How do you train a regular intelligence analyst to look at misinformation and memes and things like that are so nuanced? I mean, do you develop programs to have them train on their own, or how do you work with things like that?
It's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something we've been grappling with in the IC for a very long time. And the aspect is that we have to do a multitude of different versions. We not only have to train you as the Intel analyst, but we have to then bring a force multiplier to you in the form of someone who specifically does open source and can kind of break through some of that noise and that volume and give you some of that veracity and cut down on the variety aspect of it for you, so that when you are looking at that sphere of information within your problem set, it isn't overwhelming. We talked about this. The aspect open source can become overwhelming at a certain point. And the answer is not, here's a whole bunch of accesses to licensed information and data sets, go read. I mean, so it's something that, it's very difficult. So just from a background standpoint, I was an operator and an Intel analyst as well, but I'm also a librarian. So the aspect is that type of structured thought about information is a part of the conversation that it took us a long time to get to. It took us a long time to get to because the front end of it was just give them a whole bunch of stuff, give them access, give them every tweet. I was around for when they give them every tweet, and then they'll be able to create that on their own because they'll be able to siphon through it. That's just not accurate, and leadership knows that. And so the construct of creating specific cadres of individuals who have professionalized this discipline to be able to incorporate that analysis on its own into the larger swath of analysis within structured portfolios. And that gets to the requirements conversation. Really having that conversation up front about where we are going to make the most meaning and the most benefit with that structured environment, because again, everyone can't do everything, but focusing those mission sets in those portfolios so that that information can be accessed and engaged. We do this for our S&T analysts from the aspect of foreign technology. Documentation is not something that they're all going to read because it's hard to speak both Russian and Chinese. So that's absolutely part of the conversation. But you're right, we haven't gotten there fast enough. The initial inclination was we will teach it to everyone because everyone engages in this domain. And that's why, from my perspective, particularly when I was at the D&I as the OSINT advisor, is the aspect of it is not the domain, it's the discipline when you're talking OSINT. And we need to professionalize that discipline for people like you so that then you are given a set of information that has some meaning and you can make more meaning from it.
Yeah, I'll just add a good luck. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, the technology can come so far to help out with it, but at the end of the day, if you're researching, terrorist A is talking to terrorist B, and terrorist B, talked to this guy, and they were seen in this picture together, it has to be in one brain. One human brain has to know all this stuff to then say, this is a threat. And that's a challenge. And I think from the technology point of view, like I talked about with these data scientists, hopefully we can get to the point where we make machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all the statistical and analytics easy to access, that the analyst doesn't have to know all that. It's more presented. But yeah, it's a tough problem. I mean, I've worked with agencies that will absolutely never throw away any data. They will keep everything because maybe back in the 60s, this guy talked to that guy, and that made a correlation. I'm not kidding. They will keep that data and make sure that all that stuff can be correlated. Data correlation, big challenge.
I want to address this. I know we're short on time, but this is super important. And I think also trained intel analyst by trade, geospatial for me. And I know when I saw a change, it came from the grassroots. It came from intellectually curious people on their own time tinkering with Python, with R, with some MATLAB or something. They had probably some graduate program they were a part of, and they saw some benefit. And then they didn't have the tools at work, so they were doing it in Excel, right? They were doing it in, some macro that they built. This is a while ago, but where I've seen it work is finding those people, scaling that, and then getting that buy-in to instantiate that across, a larger swath of people. I also think rotations are key. I think keeping people in one career track for the entire time is good if you need a specialist. But I think what we're looking for in a lot of cases is generalists. I think we're looking for people you are trained in a discipline, and you got to have that. You got to keep up on it. But you should also be rotating around to S&T. You should be rotating around to find out how the policy side of Intel works, right? Because then you can make a difference in the technology. Back to Joe's point, technology should be amplifying the human capability as opposed to doing it for them. We're not going to get there. Shouldn't be the point. Last thing I'll say is being connected to the strategy of the organization you're a part of. If the leadership of the organizations can cast a vision on where you want them to go and then turn your intellectually curious people loose, they will go figure out ways we never thought of to get to that destination. And I think that's really key as well. So leave it at that.
Your question, please.
Real quick. Based on things that are happening in Ukraine right now, one of the things that we've been seeing utilizing of OSINT data, OSINT information, especially from my world, it's kitty scripters, where the kids are out here data mining a lot of this stuff on their own now because it's readily available. Are we seeing more of the Navy migrating to utilizing some of those non-traditional or regular ways of utilizing OSINT and correlating that with the classified information that's more readily available to them for maritime planning and mission planning? Because again, one of the things that's happening in Ukraine right now, some of these young kids are tracking, like the Elon Musk situation. That's a prime example. Kid basically just pulled open source data, and now he's tracking everybody across the globe. And now we're doing that with these oligarch boats and stuff like that. Is that a direction that the Navy is starting to implement as far as some of those unique strategies with OSINT? Because that seems to be a trend.
Makes me think of the Bellingcats of the world and other organizations. Yeah.
No, I think that yes. I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum, and we don't exist outside of the aspect. So to some degree, there's the aspect of I think this gets to what mission, which decision space are we trying to work within? So anecdotally, not everyone needs to follow every jihadist on Twitter. It is someone's job, and they can do that job, and I don't need someone whose job it is to follow a white merchant, a shipping vessel, to do the same job. So we do try to make sure that we're not all running to the same soccer ball, and for purposes of that. So within our world in particular, that crosses over more into an operational space, into a sentiment space, into things of that nature. So I can answer from an intelligence standpoint. We absolutely try to bring to bear all of the new technologies and integrations And we try to do it in a way by which it is sustainable for us. And in our world, that means policies and processes and legalities and authorities, because that's a very important part of being the intelligence community for the United States. We don't want to create the idea that we're doing things like following individuals and their plane around the world just because you can. So just because you can do something doesn't mean we are doing it. But where it is appropriate for the purposes of our requirements in our mission space, where it is appropriate, we look to the technologies in the commercial space and the capabilities there, and then we figure out a way to get to yes where we need to.
I'll take a slightly different angle from an industry perspective, because I can, and talk about things you can't talk about. And that is that we are finding innovations sooner and at lower TRL levels than ever before. I think we're seeing two guys in a garage can come up with a very good algorithm that we could field a lot faster, potentially, than waiting for a Series E startup, right? Maybe we're looking at Series A's now, where they're very early and they may fail as a company, but they got good tech. Maybe we can field that and bring it to bear, right? I know personally we are doing that much more. Changes the risk tolerance, changes the integration effort, and all of those other execution things. But absolutely is the answer. And I know personally we have seen things that we would have passed over in the past just because the velocity of needs is increasing. So your tolerance to what is mature has to change as well.
Next question, please.
Yeah. Hi. Quick question. So we talk a lot about upskilling analysts. There's a lot of changes though happening very quickly. How do we upscale senior leadership to take advantage of this decision space?
Thank you. You have some fans in the audience.
I don't know. Do I want to take this one?
Who wants to take that? Which of you senior leaders? Yeah.
So so I've been dealing with OSINT and the IC for a very long time, longer than I care to say. It is an evolving conversation. It's a conversation that comes in flows and waves. What we try to do within the OSINT environment in particular is take advantage of opportunity. So right now there's an opportunity. There's a common understanding of the leveraging of social media and open sources and public sentiment and its integration in multitudes of different flavors. And how do we take advantage of that? So my current job, my day job, plans programs when programming means money. So that's the aspect of how do I leverage that conversation in a space with enough people who have enough influence in the right place and the right time so that we can build out sustainable programmatics to get to the point of the helping the Intel analyst long term. And so that is something that you just have to be integrated into those conversations in a way that is constantly seeking opportunity for that conversation. And there has been a significant shift in the understanding, I will say. When I came in, it was still people, oh, that's just the internet. Like, that's not really there anymore. We don't often have, a one-star who's like, I don't believe in this. But it's almost flipped to the aspect of it's so important and it's so big of a problem that it's almost too big for them to put their hands around at this point. Yeah. So they become overwhelmed with the decision space. So our job, the people, in my world who work at the OSINT in particular, is to bring me a structured engagement, a structured idea, a structured plan that then I can advocate in ways that make meaning to those people. And then we do that across the board. All the services are doing that. All the agencies are doing that. Finding those pivot points of the intersection of the linchpin aspect of here's all the informed conversation and here's what we can do. Make it a real plan with a real need against a real requirement in a real mission space. And then we can articulate that because the appetite is there. It's just the need is which one of these 87,000 things do I pick? Well, I'll give you some options.
I give one piece of guidance to my teams as we're going out and solving hard problems, and that is to be useful. The quickest way to change a senior leader's mind is to solve a problem that they're struggling with. It's just been my experience my entire career is just go fix something that they're struggling with. It may be mundane to big brains, to say, oh, wow, I mean, it's really just, cleaning his Excel column, well, if that Excel column is making his life easier, go do that first, and not say, look, we could solve these very complex challenges if we just had, adversarial network and a neural net in place. We could do that, sir. It doesn't help me, right? So solve problems, be useful, and I think that's how we change minds. And I think certainly the new wave of leadership coming in is of that persuasion, I think, already to receive and do with that kind of intel as well.
Yeah, and I think from a research and development point of view, we need the government to come to us and say, these are our big problems. And a lot of times, they're really easy. There's this huge amount of low-hanging fruit. Well, if only it could put this on a map. And we're like, you just want it on a map? And it solves this huge problem. Back to Excel. I mean, I've been saying this for a while. I mean, if only we could have Microsoft Excel handle trillions of rows, we'd solve the world's problems. So that's my next project.
We are at time, but if you make your question really short, I promise we'll try to squeeze it in.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm Alex Moseson with SFL Scientific, which develops custom AI algorithms and architectures. And you've been asked about the analysts, the leaders. I want to ask a similar question about the tools. So in which cases are the traditional deterministic tools in image analysis or machine translation sufficient? And in which cases do you really need AI, their counterparts in computer vision or NLP?
You want to take that one, Joe?
Yeah. So how are we using it now? So with object detection. So object detection, image classification. So I'm getting this YouTube video in, and it's got 3 people's faces in it. Where else have I seen those 3 people's faces? I don't know who those 3 people are, but I know I've seen a similar looking face in this other, post, that sort of thing, and we're working on, clustering algorithms, things like that is one of the areas. It's pretty cool stuff. I mean, it's an exciting area. The stuff that you can find out just from, I'm going to search YouTube for news, and I'm going to pull in, a few thousand videos, and I'm going to look at all the faces I've seen, and then I'm going to automatically cluster them, and it's going to say all these faces were seen with these faces, and then a user comes in and says, that's Putin, and he's seen with all these people. It's a pretty neat area, but that's one of the areas that I think is challenging, and then adding more classes. What other objects can we pull out? Climate change. I mean, a huge number of areas for object detection, image classification with that. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think there's always opportunity to the point, and he made in the aspect of if you can make meaning out of something. We deal in vast amounts of unstructured data. I mean, structured in ways that we make meaning out of it, but it doesn't naturally incorporate with open source. Those come in different waves and in different styles and different structures and formats and processes. So anyway, where you can kind of take that YouTube video and also have it make meaning with our systems and structures. With one of the gentlemen earlier talked about how he had come from industry and he was to the government. He was on Microsoft 7. That's our reality. So sometimes we are offered things that are wonderful, but have no chance of working with our systems currently. And the bridge to connect those two things is so large and expensive that we lose our opportunity. And that's not going to change to that degree. We can make steps, and there's other IT people who, the CIOs were up on the stage earlier, and they probably get right in that. But the reality is that for that Intel analyst, we need to make it work with their information systems currently, and then we can make progress over time. But too often they're trying to pull us too far down the path, and we just can't get there at the same tempo. So that's it's not the same type of answer, and it's not as fun, but it's a little bit more of a realistic approach because we want to get there. The desire is there. But sometimes we just need you to work with me, and I can work with you, like that type of aspect.
We're getting played off the stage.
We are. Wow, that's fascinating.
Music
like the
equivalent of
Oscars, exactly. Wrap it up. All right, well, with that, thank you very much to Joe and to Megan and to Andy and to all of you for a great discussion. This was terrific. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.